Now, two suspects have been arrested, stormed the Equity Bank branch there, and took off with money of unknown value.
November 5th, 2016, Kayole, Nairobi. At exactly 8 p.m., the alarm inside Equity Bank Kayole begins to ring. Security guards hear it. Tenants in the neighboring building hear it too. Even the nearby businessmen and women steps outside to check. But surprisingly, nobody panics, because the alarm had gone on and off a couple of times the same night, and all the concerned neighbors headed back to their usual business of the night. The cause of the alarm, they were told, were false triggers, electrical faults, and any present sound was routine noise. So the streets remain calm again, shops close, and matatus fade into the distance. Kayole slowly falls asleep. But inside a locked room behind Equity Bank, something violent is unfolding. Men wearing gloves and overalls kneel beside a concrete wall. Gas cylinders hiss in the darkness, and metal grinders scream against reinforced steel. Sparks burst through the room like gunfire, and with every passing minute, the wall separating them from millions of shillings grows thinner. Inside the bank, surveillance cameras suddenly go black. The alarm keeps shutting on and off, but no police arrive. Even the security guard outside is unconcerned. No one knows it yet, but one of the most daring bank robberies in Kenya's history is already underway. And by sunrise, millions would be gone. But to understand how they pulled it off, we have to go back to where the plan truly began. On August 2016, 3 months before the robbery, a man quietly rented a tiny business stall directly behind Equity Bank Kayole. The room was cramped, had bare concrete walls and a blue metal door. It had just enough space for a mattress, a few tools, and a welding machine hidden beneath old sacks. To neighbors, he looked harmless, quiet, and reserved. In the following months, this man would keep to himself, avoid unnecessary conversation, and slowly become part of the background noise of Kayole. But behind the locked door, the room was being transformed into something else entirely, a launch point. Every night after businesses closed, the man studied the wall separating his stall from the bank and tapped sections of concrete. He measured distances, counted footsteps, and learned the rhythms of the building next door. He learned when guards changed shifts, when the caretaker locked the compound, and when the streets became silent enough for drilling to disappear into the sounds of Nairobi's nightlife. At this point, the crew already understood something important. Breaking through the front entrance of the bank would be suicide. This is because Equity Bank branches were protected by physical guards and multiple alarm systems linked directly to private security control rooms. And even if the robbers reached the vault successfully, silent signals would instantly alert armed response teams across Nairobi. But the robbers had another idea. What if the alarms never reached the response team? That's where the insiders came in. The next step in the heist involved the gang quietly compromising 2 men responsible for the bank's security network. The first was Zablon Motari, a G4S guard stationed at the Kayole branch. Motari's job was simple: monitor the premises, check if there were any security issues, and react immediately to suspicious activity. His job during the heist would be physical counter-surveillance. meaning that he would ensure that any unusual vibrations, drilling sounds, or suspicious movement around the rear stall remained ignored throughout the night for the heist to go on uninterrupted. The second insider was even more important, a Wells Fargo signaling officer who was working remotely at the alarm monitoring headquarters. Every major alarm signal triggered at the bank passed through systems he helped oversee. If emergency alerts appeared, his responsibility was to escalate them immediately by calling the police and the bank's management. But Jonah would become the crew's most valuable asset. Together, the two men played a crucial role in creating the perfect blind spot. If alarms were accidentally triggered during the break-in, they made sure that nobody would respond. The typical inside men. And slowly, the crew began to shape up, and they prepared for something far larger than an ordinary robbery. Jonah was also the intellectual cornerstone of the entire operation, or the mastermind. While the drilling crew handled the physical breach, he handled the digital side of the robbery. If systems failed, he would ignore them. If alarms were triggered, he would suppress them. And if the bank's defenses began collapsing in real time, nobody outside would know because he would hide all the logs. Now, the crew was ready to focus on the next stage that involved the breach itself. This is where the next members of the crew came in, identified as James Kamau and Simon Mahoro. These two were the operations engineering team, tasked with solving the hardest part of the robbery, physically getting inside the bank without attracting attention. The two helped select the specific stall behind the bank and rented the space for their operation. They were also tasked with deciding the exact section of wall closest to the vault and server rooms in order to begin digging the tunnel. Night after night, the crew quietly moved equipment into the rented room. This involved heavy-duty drills, industrial grinders, gas welding cylinders, and cutting torches powerful enough to slice through reinforced steel. To neighbors, the noises sounded ordinary, as Kayole was full of mechanics, welders, and repair shops working late into the night. Metallic sounds were able to blend naturally into the area, and that camouflage became part of the plan. The gang spent weeks studying how long drilling could continue before attracting suspicion. They tested sound levels, movement patterns, and escape timings. Meanwhile, the final member of the crew prepared for what would happen after the robbery, because stealing the money was only half of the operation, and the real challenge was moving it. This is where Dominic Nariobo came in, a man who operated as part of the laundering and handling network, responsible for concealing the stolen cash after the heist. The crew intended to quickly spread out the money, convert portions into expensive goods, and erase the trail before investigators caught up. By late October 2016, months later, the operation was nearly ready. The crew had an access point behind the bank, insider protection at the branch, control over alarm responses, industrial equipment for cutting through vault steel, and an entire weekend window to operate undetected. Now, only one thing remained: breaking through the wall. And on the night of November 5th, 2016, the drilling finally began. On the night of November 5th, 2016, at exactly 8 p.m., the security alarm inside Equity Bank suddenly began ringing. Despite residents who lived nearby the branch hearing the alarm, nobody reacted to it. So everything continued normally, and the streets slowly emptied into the night. Inside the small rented stall, James and Simon moved through darkness carrying heavy bags filled with industrial equipment. At this point, the cramped room now looked less like a business stall and more like a construction site built for war. Then, the digital blackout began. Miles away at the Wells Fargo monitoring headquarters, emergency signals from Equity Bank Kayole started appearing on security screens. They showed system failures, camera interruptions, and alarm instability. Jonah was watching the alerts in real time, and instead of escalating them, he suppressed them. So the warnings were effectively ignored, the logs quietly buried, and no emergency response was triggered. At that exact moment, one of the busiest banks in eastern Nairobi became completely blind. And at the branch, Motari stood guard outside the bank, becoming a part of the shield protecting the robbers themselves. Drilling vibrations would shake the rear wall, trigger the alarm, and Motari never raised any concern. Neither did he investigate the stalls nearby for any suspicious activity. The crew now had exactly what they needed: enough time. Inside the rented room, James powered up the drill, and the machine bit into the reinforced walls separating the stall from the bank's interior. Sparks scattered across the floor, and metal grinders screamed through the darkness. The men worked carefully, making sure that they paused whenever footsteps passed outside and continued again. The walls grew weaker, minute by minute, and the alarms inside the banking hall were seamlessly ignored through the help of Motari. Finally, sometime deep into the night, the concrete gave way and a massive opening appeared through the rear wall of the bank. James and Simon crawled through the hole and entered the bank, bypassing every locked entrance entirely, and headed straight for the strong room. They already knew where the surveillance systems were located and disabled sections of the bank's CCTV storage network. At this point, they ignited the oxyacetylene welding torches and started cutting through heavy safes, ATM cash compartments, and deposit units one by one. Despite the drilling and noise, no one interrupted the operation. The robbers were completely alone inside the bank for hours and managed to steal over 26.1 million shillings. Residents said that they kept hearing the bank's alarms go on and off, as if someone was disarming the response system.
Mpaka mwendo ya saa 6 bado ilikuwa inalia. Inazima, inalia. Inazima, inalia tena. Na watu ya Falcon bado walikuwa nakuja. Badala ya maybe wanaangalia huko juu. Nilikuwa naona wanamulika.
And still, the robbers were not done. They sliced open the ATM deposit units and emptied every accessible compartment. Then, just before dawn, the crew began disappearing the same way they came in, carrying the money back through the hole. They abandoned some of the tools they used in the heist at the bank, and this is how the scene looked like. And on their way out, the small stall behind the bank was locked from the outside once again, with the robbers disappearing by sunrise. What would be found the next day was surprising, because somehow a group of thieves had gotten away with one of Kenya's biggest bank heists and vanished into the night without anybody noticing. Hours later on Sunday afternoon, technicians at Equity Bank headquarters noticed something strange in their systems. The branch had suddenly gone offline and ATM systems had stopped responding. At first, it looked like a technical failure, but then a manager was sent to physically inspect the branch, and what he found was unreal. A giant hole had torn through the rear wall, burned steel was scattered across the floor, vault compartments were ripped open and millions of shillings gone. Within hours, the bank had become a crime scene. And by 3 p.m., nearly 19 hours after the robbery began, investigators finally stepped inside the destroyed Equity Bank branch. The scene looked catastrophic as detectives had found abandoned tools across the floor, left behind by the robbers in their rush to disappear. And almost immediately, they realized that this was not the work of ordinary thieves, and that it involved precise planning and military precision. The discovery of the tunnel led them to stalls, and this detail alone changed everything because they now understood that the master planner had studied the bank for a very long time. Next, attention immediately shifted towards the bank's security systems not triggering while systems were offline. A review of the alarm records from the night showed that it had been repeatedly triggered for hours and no response was suggested. They discovered that the security logs had been deleted, and at this point, the police knew that the robbers likely had inside help. This first suspect was Motari, the G4S guard stationed at Equity Bank, and this suspicion that he caused the digital security failures at Wells Fargo tied him to next suspect Jonah. Both Motari and Jonah were arrested due to their failure to monitor emergency alerts and escalate active breaches to police and bank management. With these two in custody, detectives no longer viewed it like negligence, but a coordinated operation with two insiders. Within days, Motari and Jonah helped in the reconstruction of the rest of the operation, piece by piece, with the trail leading investigators to the ones who physically executed the heist. James and Simon were arrested, and raids were carried out in multiple homes in search for the cash and communication records linked to the robbery. Then, weeks later, detectives made another breakthrough, arresting Dominic Nairobi, 45, due to his ties to the heist as a financial handler responsible for moving and concealing the stolen cash after the robbery. When police searched his house, they recovered nearly 490,000 shillings alongside newly purchased electronics and household goods believed to have been bought using the stolen money. One by one, the crew members fell, and 5 men stood accused in connection with one of the boldest bank robberies Kenya had ever seen. James, Simon, Motari, Jonah, and Dominic Nairobi all went down for the robbery. And for nearly an entire night in Nairobi, these men had successfully dug a hole, stole millions of shillings, and nearly disappeared into the sunset. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thanks for watching.